So if I'm not paying for either one of these knives and price is irrelevant, I like the Blackfoot slightly better than the Buck 113. But if I'm paying for them and this is $300 and this is $80 and that $220 is meaningful to me, and it means another tank of gas that's going to take me on a hunting trip or something, I'll go with the Buck 113. All right, today we're going to talk about knives, and in particular high-end versus budget options. And I'm going to talk about 3 different classes of knives. The type of knives that you're just going to carry every day, your field dressing or just a hunter's knife, kind of your average hunter's knife, and then third, a skinning knife. I'll go over some budget options for you and higher end options, but more importantly, I want to talk to you about the theory when it comes to these different options and where you might want to end up on the spectrum, because knives are interesting when you talk about people who use them on a professional basis. We're talking about butchers, hunting guides, people that use them every day. Unlike, say, a photographer, right? A professional photographer is going to use a higher end camera than the average person. They're going to use more expensive lenses. When it comes to knives, a lot of professionals actually use the budget option. So I'll explain to you why that is, and I'll also explain to you why you might fall into that category and why you may not. And that's going to drive where you want to end up on this spectrum for those 3 different categories of knives. So let's jump into it. If you have no clue who I am, I don't blame you at all. My name's Cliff Gray, and for the last decade, I've guided and outfitted some of the most remote wilderness in North America. All these videos are a reflection on that experience in that data set. All I hope is they help you out. If they do me a huge favor and like them and subscribe to the channel. All right, so let's first jump into everyday carry knives, knives that you're going to carry with you all the time. So it doesn't matter if you're hunting or just your everyday existence on this earth, you always should be carrying a knife. My recommendation is to get an everyday carry knife that's a clip pocket knife. All of mine fall into this category. They're just knives that clip on the pocket. And nowadays, most of these knives have pretty decent clips. And one thing to note is the clip on your knife and how likely it is that you don't lose one of these clip knives. It actually has a lot less to do with the clip on the knife and more to do with your pants, right? So consider that. Some pants they stick to better than others. You'll just have to figure that out. You can test them, it's pretty obvious. But the reason I like a clip knife is I can carry it comfortably all the time. So it doesn't matter if I'm wearing a belt, it doesn't matter if I'm wearing different layers, and it doesn't matter if I'm wearing a backpack. Because this knife, anytime I'm in the outdoors, I'm surely going to be carrying it. It's not like if I'm going on a hunt or I'm going to go guide a hunt that I take my everyday carry knife and put it in storage and then just rely on my hunting knives. I always have this knife in my pocket, and that clip allows me to do that. Other knives that you've got to carry in a scabbard on your belt, you're carrying it in a sheath down in your pocket, on a string, those sort of goofy things, I really don't think those are near as applicable and useful as these clips. This is a Benchmade Gripptilian. This knife, depending on how you modify it and the different options, you're talking about a $300 to $500 knife. And one of the nice things about Benchmades is they are made in the US. A mid-tier option that I've always recommended to people is this Kershaw knockout knife. This is a great clip knife. I like to have a little belly in my knife, but it's still simple. This knife is also made in the US, which is nice. The thing about this knife is it's out of production, so you can still find it on Amazon and eBay, but you're looking at somewhere around $120, $150, where when it was in production, it was around $80. You can find a similar model. I just haven't used it, but it looks very similar by Kershaw. It's called the Link, and that's gonna run you about $80, so I'm sure that's a great option for you also. And then this is the cheapo Charlie option, right? This is the cameless wedge. I have found this knife in Walmart for like $7 or $8. You can find it online for $10 to $15. There's gonna be a bunch of similar options out there. It's just a cheaper, soft metal knife that's easy to sharpen. But the primary thing for me as an everyday carry knife is it's way lighter and it's way shorter. But for just my routine stuff day to day, this knife fulfills the need. But I benefit from the fact that it just rides in my pocket much better than these longer, heavier knives, right? I can put it right here and I barely feel it. The other thing about it is it's just smaller and the depth right here. If you're carrying an iPhone in your pocket and you don't want this knife to be jiggling against your iPhone screen, I can totally understand that. These bigger knives, that's much harder to avoid. These smaller knives, it's easier. I'm gonna dive in more into some theory on these next 2 categories of knives in terms of the higher end options versus the lower end options. So I'll save that for the next couple categories. It's gonna be more relevant there, but some of that stuff does apply to why I would choose a cheaper knife versus a more expensive knife. But on this category, there's some other things that I consider too in that dynamic. One, carrying around a $300, $500 knife every day, it just feels like you're more likely to lose these knives, and a lot of people are, right? You have them in and out of your pocket all the time, and if you're not paying attention to the layer you're sticking it on, you can have it fall out of your pocket, right? So a lot of people will tend to go to budget options just because they feel like they're more likely to lose them. Outside of that, these clip knives, it's more personal preference. Do you like the shape of the blade? Are you able to do what you need to do day to day with your knife, right? And the reality is, like, for me personally, when I'm home, when I'm not up in the mountains, I'm not hunting for myself, or I'm not guiding professionally, I don't need a knife that does all that stuff, right? I just need knives that do my day-to-day things. And typically what I use a knife for mostly at home is opening up packages, you know, maybe cutting some rope, those basic things. So I tend to go with a small knife like this because I don't need a longer knife. I don't need serrations. All I need is a simple everyday carry knife, and I'm not willing to give up that convenience and small nature of this knife for a bigger knife, so I have utility for utility that I don't need, right? So just consider that a lot of this everyday carry knife, this clip knife, is all personal preference. All right, so now let's talk about your hunting knife, your field dressing knife, your quartering knife. So if you're doing just your basic hunt, this is the type of knife that can get you through the whole hunt. I'm gonna give you 3 different options here. One, you've got the Havalon. Nowadays, these are about $40. You've got the Buck 113. This is a knife that I've used for years. These knives run between $80 and $100. And then you've got a knife like Montana Knife Company's Blackfoot knife, and these knives are gonna run you about $300. All right, so now let's jump into some theory, right? Because these are 3 very different knives. Take the Havalon, right? The Havalon will get you through all the elements, skin an animal, you can make the initial cuts, you can quarter an animal, you can do everything you need to do. But in my view, a Havalon is not superior to any other knife in any of those use cases at all. It does all of those things fairly mediocre. The only thing it probably does better is it's actually superior at face caping and doing detailed work, which for most hunters out there, that use case really doesn't apply to them. All the other things that people are using this type of knife for, it's basically a scalpel with a replaceable blade on it. All the other things that they're using this knife for, they would be better off using another knife. And I can debate that with whoever. You're welcome to put a comment down and tell me why the Havalon is a better skinning knife or better quartering knife than these other options. But personally, I don't think it is, and that's based on using them on quite a few animals and using a bunch of other knives too. Now, the obvious thing about a Havalon that's superior to these other knives, and this is where we're going to dive into some theory here, is it's always sharp if you have blades with you. So if you take the time to take these blades off, replace them while you're working on animals, don't get them super dull, just replace them so you always have a sharp knife. That's where these things do a good job. And that's where this discussion is gonna drop in to an idea that I think is very relevant on this category of knives and the next category of knives. How capable are you of tuning up your knife, honing your knife, and then resharpening it if it gets to the point where it needs to be completely resharpened? For people who are incapable on that front, these replaceable blade knives are a great option. But if you're not a helpless metrosexual and you actually know how to sharpen a knife, and I think everybody should know how to sharpen a knife, go check out one of my sharpening videos. I'll stick a video up right here. I've got one that's on, just the concept of sharpening a knife. It's a little long-winded, but go check it out. I think it'll give you an understanding of how to sharpen a knife. And then I've got a new one out that goes over honing and tuning a knife. In my view, that's just as important, just staying on top of it and keeping your knife sharp. But you really should know those skills. And one of the big advantages of knowing those skills is it makes you able to use these other sort of knives, and you'll start to move away from the idea of a replaceable blade knife. You're not gonna always feel like you're dependent on the fact that you have to use a replaceable blade knife because you just don't know how to sharpen. It's a skill set you might as well know how to do, and it's gonna give you a ton of options, and as we get into this discussion further, you're gonna actually be able to save a bunch of money and still have very capable knives, but we'll get there. All right, so the next knife in this category I'm gonna talk about is the Buck 113. It's an American-made knife, which I like. This knife has been sharpened so much, I've taken a little bit of the belly out of it. The knife comes stock with a little more belly in it, but overall, I still really like the shape even after having used it so much. It's very good at quartering animals, very good at skinning animals, and gutting animals. This knife here, it's very easy to pop guts. It's very easy to pop through a hide with, right? This shape of a blade, it's much easier not to do that, all right? This knife and the steel that they use, it's pretty darn easy for me to sharpen, and this is a pretty thick knife. This is gonna be a real durable knife. Like, look down the spine of this knife. Usually thick knives like that, at a hunting knife angle on the edge, the bevel is actually gonna be pretty darn wide, so generally it's gonna be pretty hard to sharpen, but I find with this knife, soft enough that it's fairly easy for me to tune up in the field and resharpen in the field if I need to. But the other thing about this knife is when I get down to a tight spot in a ball joint, if I'm on the bottom of a bull elk and he's, you know, crunched down in a hole and I can't move him and I've got to get down to that ball joint and get that quarter off without manipulating him much, I might have to pry with my knife. A lot of people say, well, I would just never do that. I don't need to do that. Well, eventually, if you're using these knives in the field, you will run into a situation where you've got to pry a little bit with the knife. With these replaceable blade knives, it's very dangerous. I've broken several of them, and they're known for that. With this knife, you can put a little pressure on it, and you're not going to bend that tip, and that comes from the thickness of the knife. So to me, this is far superior for quartering game in situations that aren't ideal because of that. I can pry with it a little bit. All right, so now let's talk about my higher end option for this category of knife. I've got the Blackfoot from Montana Knife Company. So they've got a bunch of different knives that'll fall into this category, and they're all gonna be similar types of steel, and they're actually made in a similar way that I'll get into here. But I really like this length of knife, the level of belly in it. It's actually, you know, pretty similar in a sense to size and shape to the Buck 113 in my view in the use cases. So all the things I just said in terms of the shape make it superior to the Havalon. But the thing about this knife is look down the spine of the knife. It's a thinner knife. And the reason they make them that way is they're a harder steel. So just in general, because they're a harder steel than say like a Buck 113, they're gonna be harder to sharpen. The way they get around that a little bit is they have a smaller bevel because the spine of the knife and how thin the knife pairs down into that cutting edge bevel is. It's so much thinner, right? Like, I mean, feel this, compare these two. Because it's thinner, at the same angle, that bevel is going to be smaller, and therefore you're going to have to remove less metal, or you're going to have to touch up less metal if you're honing it. So this knife is actually comparable to this Buck 113 in terms of sharpening. Now, the more expensive Blackfoot, it has the advantage of being harder metal. So just in general, it should hold an edge longer than the Buck 113. So that accounts for some of the cost difference. You're talking about this knife costs a little over, well, I guess 3 times what this knife does. This knife costs less than $100, and this knife costs $300 as of, you know, this video. So there's a pretty significant price difference. This knife, that's one of the reasons. This is just more expensive. It's harder metal. Now, one downside that this knife still has over this knife is that this knife, the point, if I was really getting after it and being brutal to this knife and bending on it and prying on this point of this knife, the tip of this knife, this more expensive Montana Knife Company knife is going to break. The tip is going to break before this Buck 113, and that's because just the heft of the knife. Now, does it matter? That's really up to you. I think you'd still have to be very brutal on this knife, and I've been told directly from Josh Smith of Montana Knife Company that if a tip breaks, they'll fix it, no questions asked. So I don't know that it's that big of a deal, but it's just something to consider when you think about these two different types of knives. Other components here before we jump into the last category, where I really get into the details of this budget stuff versus the more expensive knives and that trade-off and why you might choose one over the other, is this knife, it does just have a higher quality handle than the Buck 113. It's got a nice feel to it. I can understand why people would look at these two knives and they feel this Montana Knife Company knife and they're going to say, yeah, that feels like a more expensive knife than the Buck 113. So there is just that element too, right? But still, there's trade-offs even with the bounds of the fact that there's a huge price difference here. So if I'm not paying for either one of these knives and price is irrelevant, I like the Blackfoot slightly better than the Buck 113. But if I'm paying for them and this is $300 and this is $80 and that $220 is meaningful to me, and it means another tank of gas that's going to take me on a hunting trip or something, I'll go with the Buck 113. But that's really a personal question for you. And now that I've discussed the little intricacies there, I hope you understand why you would go one way or the other way. All right, so let's talk about skinning knives. A lot of you are going to say, all I need is my everyday carry knife and then my hunting knife. I can skin animals with it. I don't need a specific skinning knife. I think that if you actually start using a skinning oriented knife, you're going to find that there's some huge advantages, right? Just the belly on one of these knives, right? It's going to allow you to much more efficiently skin animals. So if you're skinning, big capes on bull elk or full body capes on mountain goats, or you're skinning, just a lot of hanging whitetail in a shed somewhere, there's a huge advantage to this type of knife, particularly if you keep it sharp. So first, let's talk about budget options. This is the Victorinox beef skinner, and this is the Victorinox lamb skinner. I've used both. I've used the beef skinner more. So those are going to be your budget options. These knives are going to run you between $30 and $45 a piece. And then on the higher end of things, you've got the Montana Knife Company Stonewall knife, and this knife's going to run you around $325 as of this video at least. A huge price difference, right? Literally almost 10 times the price of these knives. But the thing about it is the vast majority of professionals who are carrying a skinning knife, you're gonna see them carry this type of knife, this level of knife. A lot of them use these Victorinox knives in particular, but a lot of them use Dexter knives that are similar, or other brands that are similar quality. The big difference here is people who are using these skinning knives a lot and these budget knives, they're honing these knives up and tuning these knives up constantly and keeping them razor sharp all the time. There's absolutely no debate. This type of knife, this $30 or $40 knife, is much easier to sharpen than this type of knife like the Stonewall. And the reason is, in terms of skinning, you're not going to be prying with the knife or anything like that, so it doesn't need to be thick. And the other thing is these budget knives are just made out of cheaper metal, so they're easier to manipulate. They're easier to hone up the edge. They're easier just to clean up that way, and they're much easier to just sharpen back up, right, if you get them dull. There's a couple other smaller reasons why you're going to see a lot of professionals using these type of skinning knives. One, the handles are just more ergonomic. They're more comfortable. And I think that just comes down to marketing, right? The higher end knives like this Stonewall, they have to have a certain type of handle to justify the cost, right? If they put a plastic soft handle, a handle that gives and is probably not near as durable, if they put that on a $325 knife, they're gonna have a hard time selling it. Whereas a $30 knife, why not have just that utility driven handle? So why are these Victorinox knives so much easier to sharpen? Well, one, they've got a thinner blade. Given the same, edge angle is gonna make them easier to sharpen because that bevel's thinner. The other thing is just overall, this is gonna be made out of cheaper metal, softer metal that's easier to manipulate, easier to hone up, easier to sharpen. And that's why you see this type of knife used by butchers all the time, right? This quality of knife, this price point of knife, this is the type of knife that you see, and that's the primary reason. Those guys know how to stay on top of their knives. They always want them sharp, and they want a knife that they can easily tune up and sharpen. All right, so the obvious question is, why would anybody buy this Stonewall knife for $325 versus this Victorinox knife for $30 or $40? Well, first, there's an element that's just obvious, right? This knife tends to look cooler than this knife, right? So that's relevant to some folks. The next thing about this knife is gonna have a little broader utility. So if I'm talking about taking a knife just for specific type of hunt, and in particular mountain goat hunt. So if I'm guiding a mountain goat hunt where I know I'm gonna have to full body cape a mountain goat, so I'm gonna end up doing a lot of skinning, but I'm also gonna be very interested in how light I can keep my pack, and I really only wanna take one knife, this Stonewall has been a pretty good option for me. And the reason being is there's enough tip here, it's sturdy enough, durable enough, that I have a little more utility than I would if, say, I brought this beef skinner, because I can still gut the animal, I can still quarter the animal with this knife, and I feel like it's more durable than those options. So there are specific use cases where I would prefer the Stonewall over these knives if I wasn't thinking about the money part of it, right? There's obviously that component that's, you know, that's more of a personal thing. For specific hunts, would it make sense for you to spend much more money on this knife versus this knife? That just depends. But overall, I'm gonna say that for vast majority of applications that involve skinning, carrying one of these budget knives makes the most sense as long as you can sharpen the knife. If you're incapable of sharpening a knife, you want to drop back to a knife like this because it's made out of harder metal, a higher quality metal that's going to hold the edge longer. A knife like this, if you just don't touch it, you don't tune it up, you don't hone it, and you don't try to sharpen it yourself, it's probably going to last 10 times the work that this knife will. These knives, the huge downside of these budget knives is if you're not staying on top of them and you're not sharpening them, they're gonna get dull, and they'll get dull where it's unmanageable in a fairly short period of time relative to a knife like the Stonewall. The takeaway really is that you can create a set of knives for a fairly low budget that are very high utility, and the proof is out there amongst the professionals. The butchers, the hunting guides, the folks using these knives every day, a lot of them have a budget setup of knives. Just make sure that if you go this budget route, you've got to know how to hone those knives, and you got to know how to tune those knives and stay on top of them. I've got a video here, I'll stick it right here, go check it out. If you got value out of this video, do me a huge favor and like it and subscribe to the channel. I'll catch you guys later.